The rifle that changed British warfare forever. A boring history. Bedtime story. Before we begin tonight's journey into history, a moment. Close your eyes if you'd like. Feel the weight of your head against the pillow. Notice the temperature of the air around you. Let your breathing slow just a little. Tonight we're traveling back to a mountain ridge in Spain. The year is 1809. The early morning mist clings to the rocky slopes. A British soldier lies motionless among the scrub and stone. He wears a dark green jacket, not the famous red. In his hands, a weapon that looks different from the others. Longer than a pistol, shorter than most military muskets. The metal is cold against his cheek as he aims. The rifling inside the barrel catches the morning light. 700 yards away, a French officer examines a map. The rifleman exhales slowly, squeezes the trigger gently. The crack of the shot echoes across the valley. The French officer falls, never knowing what hit him. This is the story of how warfare changed forever. Not through grand strategy or massive battles alone, but through a piece of technology that people kept forgetting, then remembering, then forgetting again. The Baker rifle transformed British military thinking. Then the military forgot the transformation. Then they remembered it. Then they forgot it again. This cycle repeated across nearly a century. Each time men died while institutions relearned old lessons. Each time the same arguments emerged for and against. The rifle itself never changed its fundamental nature. It remained accurate, deadly, and transformative. But human institutions proved remarkably resistant to change. Tonight, we'll trace this pattern through 4 distinct periods. First discovery, first suppression, rediscovery, and final acceptance. We'll examine why a weapon that saved lives got shelved repeatedly. We'll explore the tension between individual skill and mass warfare. We'll see how social class shaped military technology adoption. And we'll consider what this tells us about innovation itself. The story begins in a London workshop in the year 1800. Section 1, The Discovery, Ezekiel Baker's workshop. Imagine the smell of gun oil and metal shavings. Whitechapel, London, at the turn of the 19th century. A neighborhood of craftsmen, workshops, and narrow streets. The sound of hammering drifts from a dozen forges. In one particular shop, Ezekiel Baker bends over his work. He's a master gunsmith with a growing reputation. His hands are stained with oil and powder residue. Around him, partially completed weapons lie on workbenches. Baker has been thinking about a problem for years now. The British Army's standard musket is famously inaccurate. Soldiers joke that you couldn't hit a barn door at 50 paces. This isn't quite true, but it's not entirely false either. The Brown Bess musket is a marvel of robust simplicity. It can be loaded and fired quickly by trained soldiers. 3 rounds per minute in the hands of a good infantryman. But accuracy? That's another matter entirely. The smooth barrel provides no guidance to the projectile. The ball rattles down the barrel, emerging at unpredictable angles. At 100 yards, hitting a man-sized target is largely luck. The military doesn't really mind this fact very much. Their doctrine relies on massed volley fire, not individual accuracy. Hundreds of muskets firing together create a wall of lead. Individual accuracy matters less than collective firepower. But Baker knows that rifling changes everything completely. Cut spiral grooves inside a barrel, and the ball spins. Spinning projectiles fly straighter, farther, and more predictably. Hunters and target shooters have known this for centuries. German and Swiss gunsmiths perfected rifles generations ago, so why doesn't the British Army use them? That's the question Baker wants to answer and overcome. He understands the practical objections perfectly well. Rifles take longer to load than smoothbore muskets do. The ball must fit tightly to engage the rifling grooves. This means forcing it down the barrel with significant effort. After a few shots, powder residue builds up inside. Each subsequent shot becomes harder to load than the last. In the heat of battle, this could prove fatal. A soldier struggling with his weapon is a dead soldier. The British Army has tried rifles before without much success. The Ferguson rifle showed promise in the American Revolutionary War. But it was complex, expensive, and required skilled maintenance. When Major Ferguson died at King's Mountain, interest died too. The project was abandoned, the rifles put into storage. Military establishments hate complexity and specialized equipment. They prefer weapons that common soldiers can maintain easily. Weapons that work when dropped in mud or rivers. Weapons that don't require precision or special training. Baker knows all these arguments by heart and memory. He's heard them from officers, ordnance officials, and fellow gunsmiths. But he believes he can address each objection systematically. His design represents years of careful thought and experimentation. The barrel will be shorter than standard German hunting rifles, 30 inches instead of 42 for easier handling. 7 grooves cut with a quarter-turn twist along the length, deep enough for accuracy, but not so deep as to foul quickly. The caliber will be .625 inches, taking a spherical ball, smaller than the Brown Bess, meaning less powder and less recoil. A rifleman could carry more ammunition for the same weight. The stock will be made from seasoned walnut for durability. The lock mechanism, standard military issue for parts commonality. Nothing fancy, nothing that requires specialized maintenance. A sword bayonet instead of the standard spike bayonet. This gives the rifleman a close combat option and tool. The entire weapon weighs about 9 pounds when loaded, slightly heavier than a musket, but not prohibitively so. Baker's breakthrough isn't any single innovation particularly. It's the synthesis, the balance of competing requirements, accurate enough to justify the slower loading rate, simple enough for military adoption and battlefield maintenance, robust enough to survive campaign conditions and soldier use, affordable enough to produce in meaningful quantities. In 1800, he presents his design to the Board of Ordnance. The board consists of tradition-minded officers and administrators. They've seen dozens of proposed improvements over the years. Most promised miracles and delivered expensive complications. But Baker is patient, methodical, and increasingly persuasive. He arranges demonstrations at 100 yards, 200 yards, 300. His rifle hits targets that muskets can barely reach. The officers are impressed despite their initial skepticism. They authorize a trial run of several hundred weapons. These will be issued to experimental units for field testing. The results will determine whether to proceed with mass production. Baker returns to his workshop with the contract in hand. He knows this is just the beginning of the real battle. Proving the weapon works is one thing entirely. Convincing the military to change its doctrine is quite another. The army is an institution built on drill, discipline, and conformity. Riflemen would need to think independently, to act individually. They would need to aim rather than fire on command. They would need judgment as much as obedience. This threatens fundamental assumptions about military organization. The ideal British soldier follows orders without question or thought. He stands in formation and fires when told to fire. His individual skill matters less than his collective discipline. The rifle threatens this model at its very foundation. A good rifleman is a semi-independent warrior, not a cog. He selects targets, judges distance, controls his fire rate. He might take cover rather than stand in formation. He might refuse a shot rather than waste ammunition. This requires intelligence, initiative, and judgment-worrying qualities. Officers fear soldiers who think too much for themselves. What if they start questioning orders or military hierarchy? What if they decide they're too valuable to risk needlessly? The rifle thus becomes more than a technical question alone. It becomes a question about the nature of military service, about class, about trust, about social order itself. Baker probably doesn't fully grasp these implications at first. He's a craftsman solving a technical problem through better design. But his solution will force the British Army to confront uncomfortable questions, questions they'll spend the next century trying to avoid. Take a breath here. Feel the weight of your body against the bed. Notice how your shoulders have relaxed just a little. We're going to move forward now through the story. But there's no rush at all. We have all the time we need. Section 2. The material. Reality: why muskets dominated. To understand why the rifle faced such resistance, we must understand the musket. The Brown Bess musket represented 2 centuries of development, not development toward accuracy but toward battlefield reliability. It was the culmination of very different priorities. Imagine you're a British general in the year 1800. You command thousands of men, most of them barely trained. Many are pressed into service, some are criminals avoiding jail. They receive perhaps a few weeks of basic drill before deployment. You cannot make these men into expert marksmen quickly, but you can teach them to stand in line and fire together. Load, present, fire, reload. The sequence is deeply drilled. 3 shots per minute, that's the standard expected rate. A battalion of 600 men creates 1,800 shots per minute. This is the wall of lead that wins battles for Britain. Not accuracy, but volume of fire delivered in synchronized volleys. The mathematics of musket warfare are brutal and simple. Individual shots rarely hit their intended target directly. But fire enough shots at a formation, some will hit. The Brown Bess helps maximize the number of shots fired. Its smooth bore allows rapid loading even by trembling hands. The generous tolerance between ball and barrel aids speed. A soldier can load without perfect technique or careful aim, even with powder residue building up inside the barrel, even with hands shaking from fear or cold or exhaustion, even in rain, though dampened powder limits that advantage. The weapon is famously robust and nearly impossible to break. Soldiers use them as clubs, levers, and walking sticks. They drop them in rivers and mud and still fire them. The simple lock mechanism rarely jams or fails completely. Parts are interchangeable between weapons, simplifying field repairs. This robustness emerges from more than a century of battlefield experience. Every weak point has been strengthened through trial and error. Every complication has been eliminated through bitter practical lessons. What remains is a weapon optimized for mass production and use. Not elegant, not sophisticated, but profoundly fit for its purpose. The British military has built its entire tactical system around it. Formations, drill sequences, logistics all assume the Brown Bess. Training manuals, officer education, strategic thinking, all incorporate its capabilities and limitations. Changing the weapon means changing everything else as well. This is why innovation faces such institutional resistance. It's not stupidity or blindness, but systems thinking. A military is not a collection of individual soldiers. It's an integrated system of training, supply, tactics, and culture. Change one element, and you must change many others. The rifle's accuracy matters far less than the musket's integration. Consider the logistics of ammunition supply as another factor. Brown Bess balls can be cast quickly in field conditions. The generous barrel tolerance means imperfect balls still work. Soldiers can even use captured ammunition or improvise projectiles. Rifle balls require more precision in manufacture and sizing. Each must fit the bore closely to engage the rifling properly. This means centralized production and reliable supply chains. In the chaos of campaign, this presents serious vulnerabilities. What happens when rifles run out of proper ammunition? Can soldiers improvise, or do the weapons become useless? The musket's flexibility provides crucial battlefield resilience. Then there's the question of training time and cost. Teaching volume fire requires weeks of drill and practice. Teaching marksmanship requires months or even years of development. A rifleman must understand trajectory, wind effects, and distance judgment. He must practice until proper technique becomes second nature. He must maintain his weapon more carefully than a musketeer does. All this requires time, money, and organizational commitment. For an army that often expands rapidly during wartime, this seems impractical. Better to have 10,000 adequate musketmen than 1,000 excellent riflemen. Better to rely on proven doctrine than experiment with new approaches. The officer corps has its own reasons to prefer muskets. Musket tactics emphasize officer control and soldier obedience. Officers direct when to fire, when to advance, when to withdraw. Individual soldiers need not make tactical decisions themselves. This reinforces military hierarchy and maintains discipline. Riflemen operating independently threaten this control structure. If soldiers think for themselves in combat, where does it stop? Might they question strategy, leadership, even social order itself? The rifle thus represents a subtle threat to authority, not intentionally but through the nature of its use. A weapon that requires judgment encourages the development of judgment. A weapon that requires independence encourages independent thinking. For an officer corps drawn largely from the aristocracy, this is concerning. They're comfortable commanding obedient masses, not thinking individuals. The social implications of military technology are never far from consideration, but practical considerations dominate the official arguments against rifles. Loading time remains the most frequently cited objection. In the time a rifleman loads once, a musketeer loads 3 times. In a close-range firefight, this tripled firepower seems decisive. The rifleman's superior accuracy at long range seems less relevant. Most battles are decided at ranges where both weapons hit reliably, or so the argument goes, repeated in mess halls and military studies. This argument contains truth but ignores context completely. It assumes all combat occurs at close range in open terrain. It assumes enemies always cooperate by closing to musket range. It assumes firepower always matters more than precision always. These assumptions work in European warfare's traditional contexts. In open fields with formal armies fighting symmetrical battles, but the world contains mountains, forests, cities, and irregular warriors. It contains situations where accuracy matters far more than volume. It contains enemies who learn not to close with British formations. The rifle excels in exactly these non-traditional contexts. But the British military establishment rarely fights non-traditional wars, or rather, they fight them but don't build doctrine around them. Colonial conflicts are seen as aberrations, not the future of warfare. The real battles are European, formal, and traditional, so the musket remains king, unchallenged by practical experience. The rifle becomes a specialized tool for special situations. Not wrong exactly, but not the foundation of military power. This is the material and institutional reality that Ezekiel Baker confronts. His rifle works brilliantly, but it threatens too many established patterns. It requires too much change, too much adaptation, too much thinking. Better to keep it as a limited experiment than embrace it fully. This logic will dominate for decades to come repeatedly. Pause here for a moment. Let your jaw relax, unclenching any tension there. Notice the darkness behind your closed eyelids. The story continues, but we move at a gentle pace. SE Section 3, the 95 The Rifles, a revolutionary unit. In 1800, the British Army authorizes an experimental unit, the 95th Regiment of Foot, equipped with Baker rifles, but experimental in more ways than just their weapons. This regiment will challenge military orthodoxy on multiple levels. Their uniform is green, not the traditional British red. Dark rifle green designed for concealment rather than display. This choice is practical but also deeply symbolic of change. British infantry has worn red coats for over a century. The color represents tradition, discipline, empire, and power. It makes soldiers visible on the battlefield, aids command and control. In the smoke of black powder combat, identification matters greatly. Green jackets, by contrast, suggest stealth, concealment, and individual action. They suggest soldiers who hide rather than stand proudly, soldiers who use terrain rather than ignore it, soldiers who think tactically rather than simply obey. The uniform choice indicates a fundamentally different approach to war. The regiment's organization differs from standard line infantry significantly. Companies are smaller, allowing for more flexible deployment. Officers are expected to lead from the front, not the rear. Non-commissioned officers receive more authority and responsibility. The men themselves are recruited differently from typical regiments. The army specifically seeks intelligent, physically fit, motivated volunteers, not the pressed men and recruited criminals of many units. Literacy is encouraged, even expected among the riflemen. Some recruits are gamekeepers, hunters, men familiar with accurate shooting. Others are craftsmen, small merchants, men of some education. The social composition is slightly higher than standard infantry. Not gentlemen certainly, but respectable working men. This matters more than it might initially appear to outside observers. Traditional military thinking assumes soldiers need not think much. They need courage, obedience, and physical endurance, nothing more. Intelligence might even be a liability, making men question and hesitate. The 95th challenges this assumption from its founding moment. Its recruits are chosen specifically for qualities of intelligence and judgment. They're trained not just in shooting, but in fieldcraft and tactics. How to use terrain, how to estimate range, how to work independently, how to operate in pairs, covering each other's movements, how to withdraw under fire, how to harass enemy formations. The training takes longer than for standard infantry soldiers, months rather than weeks, developing both skill and tactical understanding. Each man must hit a target at 100 yards reliably. More importantly, he must know when to shoot and when to hold fire. Ammunition is precious, and wasting shots is considered a serious fault. This develops a mindset radically different from musket infantry. The musketeer fires on command, quickly in synchronized volleys. The rifleman fires when ready, deliberately, on selected targets. The musketeer is part of a machine, a cog in formation. The rifleman is a semi-autonomous actor, making tactical choices. This autonomy extends beyond individual shooting decisions. Riflemen are taught to think about battle from a tactical perspective, to understand objectives, not just orders given, to improvise when situations change, not wait for new commands, to retreat if necessary without shame or loss of honor. This last point is particularly revolutionary for British military culture. Traditional infantry stands and fights until ordered to withdraw. Retreating without orders is cowardice, punishable by death. But riflemen operating independently must judge when to fall back, when they're outnumbered, outflanked, or achieving nothing by staying. This requires trusting soldiers to make difficult judgment calls, to balance courage with prudence, aggression with survival. For officers accustomed to controlling every movement, this is disturbing. What if soldiers retreat when they should have stood? What if the privilege of withdrawal erodes military discipline generally? The answers lie in training, selection, and unit culture. Riflemen develop a fierce pride in their capability and judgment. They see themselves as elite, superior to common line infantry. This pride motivates proper use of their tactical freedom. Retreating when tactically necessary is not cowardice but professionalism. Wasting their lives pointlessly is not courage but stupidity. The regiment develops a distinctive culture that reflects these values, more egalitarian than typical units, with less rigid hierarchy. Officers are expected to be competent, not merely well-born. Men respect leaders who demonstrate skill and tactical judgment. Incompetent officers find their authority questioned and undermined subtly. This meritocratic tendency worries the traditional officer corps significantly. The British Army is built on class hierarchy and social order. Aristocratic officers command common soldiers by right of birth. The 95th suggests competence might matter more than breeding. This is socially dangerous territory for the early 19th century. But the regiment's effectiveness on campaign is undeniable. Commanders who use them properly find them invaluable for screening movements, harassing enemy formations, securing terrain, for operations where flexibility matters more than mass, for situations where thinking soldiers outperform obedient automatons. The problem is that many commanders don't know how to use them properly. They try to employ riflemen like line infantry, standing in formation, or they use them for standard garrison duties and parade ground drill. This wastes their unique capabilities and frustrates the men. The rifle is a specialized tool requiring specialized employment, but the British military system resists specialization instinctively. It prefers uniform, interchangeable units that fit standard doctrine. The 95th represents a compromise between innovation and tradition, allowed to exist but kept small and somewhat marginalized. Their green jackets mark them as different, special, not quite regular. This gives them freedom to develop their unique culture and methods, but it also limits their influence on the broader military. They're an exception, not a model for transformation. The army can point to them as evidence of progressive thinking, while simultaneously ensuring they don't fundamentally change anything. This pattern, allowing innovation at the margins while protecting the core, recurs frequently. It lets institutions claim they embrace change while actually containing it. The 95th will prove its value dramatically in coming years, but this proof won't lead to the changes one might expect. Instead, it will be interpreted as justifying their exceptional status. Rifles work for special troops and special situations, not generally. This conclusion protects existing doctrine from serious challenge. Take another slow breath here. Feel how your body has settled more deeply into rest. There's no need to hold any tension in your muscles. We're moving toward the proving ground now. SE Section 4, the Peninsular War Proving Ground. 1808, Napoleon dominates continental Europe. Spain becomes his next target for conquest and control. He places his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne by force. The Spanish people respond with fierce, chaotic, and unexpected resistance. Britain sees an opportunity to challenge French power finally. An expeditionary force deploys to the Iberian Peninsula under Wellesley, later to be known as the Duke of Wellington. The 95th Rifles are among the units sent to Spain. They're about to encounter the terrain where their weapons shine. Spain is not the flat fields of Belgium or northern France. It's a land of mountains, narrow valleys, and rocky highlands. Forests of cork oak and pine cover many hillsides. Small villages cling to defensive positions among the peaks. Roads, where they exist, wind through narrow defiles and passes. Armies cannot easily deploy in the formal lines of European battle. The landscape fragments formations, isolates units, creates opportunities for ambush, for harassment, for accurate long-range fire. Exactly the conditions where rifles outperform muskets dramatically. The French army is accustomed to victory through mass and speed. Their columns advance rapidly, deploy quickly, and overwhelm positions. Against the British line infantry, this works less well than against other opponents. British volleys are well drilled and devastatingly effective at close range, but the French adapt, using skirmishers to disrupt British formations. Voltigeurs and tirailleurs, light infantry armed with muskets. They advance ahead of the columns, sniping at British lines. British return fire is largely ineffective at skirmishing ranges. Muskets cannot consistently hit individual soldiers at 200 yards. The French skirmishers harass with relative impunity until the lines close, but then the riflemen deploy and everything changes for them. At 200 yards, a Baker rifle hits with reasonable accuracy. At 300 yards, a skilled rifleman can still kill. At 400 yards, harassing fire remains quite effective. French skirmishers suddenly find themselves outranged and outmatched. They're used to operating beyond effective musket range safely. The rifle strips away this safety margin completely. Voltigeurs begin falling to shots fired from impossible distances. They can't see the riflemen in their green jackets among the terrain. They can't return fire effectively because they're beyond musket range. They can't advance because crossing that range means certain death. The psychological effect is as important as the physical casualties. French light infantry lose their confidence and aggressive edge. They know that moving forward might mean a bullet from nowhere. This hesitation degrades their effectiveness significantly. Meanwhile, British line infantry can form up without constant harassment. They can maneuver without French skirmishers disrupting their movements. The riflemen have created space for traditional tactics to succeed. Specific engagements demonstrate the rifle's tactical value repeatedly. At Cacabelos in January 1809, one stands out particularly. The British army is retreating toward Corunna in terrible winter conditions. French cavalry and infantry pursue closely, harassing the withdrawal. The 95th forms the rear guard, buying time for the main force. At the bridge over the Kua River, they make a stand. French General Colbert leads his cavalry in a charge across the bridge. Rifleman Thomas Plunkett lies in position about 400 yards distant. He aims carefully at the mounted general, compensating for the range. The shot strikes Colbert, killing him instantly from his saddle. Before the French can react, Plunkett reloads and fires again. The second shot kills Colbert's aide who had rushed to help. 2 precise kills at extreme range, executed under pressure. The French cavalry halts, demoralized by their general's death. The 95th withdraws safely, having bought the necessary time. This engagement becomes legendary within rifle regiment culture. It exemplifies everything the rifle enables: precision, range, independence. One man's skill and judgment achieving what formations cannot. The story spreads through the British Army and even reaches London. But does it change military thinking about weapons and tactics? Not significantly, because it's interpreted as exceptional, not typical. Plunkett is seen as an extraordinary marksman, not a representative example. His achievement confirms that rifles work for special situations and special men. It doesn't suggest that all infantry should become riflemen. This pattern of interpretation protects existing doctrine repeatedly. When evidence contradicts established practice, the evidence gets marginalized. Special circumstances, exceptional individuals, unique terrain. These phrases dismiss challenges. At Talavera in July 1809, the pattern repeats. British and Spanish forces face a larger French army in open battle. The fighting is brutal, with massive casualties on both sides. The British line infantry performs admirably in the main engagement, but it's the riflemen who make several critical differences. They occupy a hill called the Cerro de Medellin before the battle. This position overlooks the French approach and the valley floor. When French columns advance, they're exposed to rifle fire from above. Officers leading the columns fall to shots from 800 yards. Color bearers drop, regimental standards falling into the dust. Musicians and drummers, easily identified, die before reaching British lines. The French columns become progressively more disorganized under this fire. Leadership is degraded, communication becomes difficult, morale suffers. When they finally close with the British line, they're already shaken. The decisive volley fire becomes even more devastating as a result. After the battle, several British officers note the rifle's contribution. Wellington himself comments favorably on the 95th's performance. But again, this doesn't translate into broader adoption or integration. The rifles remain a separate, specialized unit for specialized tasks. During the Siege of Badajoz in 1812, their value appears differently. Sieges involve complex engineering, mining, and assault operations. The French defenders have sharpshooters who harass British siege works. Every engineer or artilleryman working on trenches risks sniper fire. This slows the siege and inflicts steady casualties on the besiegers. Wellington deploys riflemen as counter-snipers to suppress the French shooters. Duels develop between individual marksmen, sometimes lasting days. The riflemen can engage French shooters at ranges where muskets are useless. They protect the siege works, allowing engineers to labor more safely. This application of the rifle is pure innovation, not traditional tactics. Nobody had written doctrine for counter-sniper operations before. The tactic emerges from practical problem-solving by thinking soldiers. Exactly the kind of adaptation the rifle and its users enable. But siege warfare is considered a specialized subset of military operations, so once again the rifle's success doesn't drive general adoption. French accounts from the Peninsular War reveal interesting perspectives too. Soldiers' letters and memoirs frequently mention the British riflemen with respect and fear. The grasshoppers, they call them, for the green jackets and elusiveness. Devils in green is another common term among French troops. The psychological impact of facing accurate long-range fire is clear. Soldiers describe the demoralization of watching comrades fall unexpectedly, of never knowing when or where the next shot might come from, of the rifle's crack echoing across valleys, announcing another death. This is warfare of a different character from the traditional model. Not masses spacing masses, but individuals targeting individuals. Not the impersonal lottery of volley fire, but deliberate selection. The French adapt their own tactics in response to the rifle threat. They begin using more terrain themselves, avoiding exposure when possible. They deploy their own specialist marksmen, though still with smoothbore muskets. They learn to respect the green jackets and the space they control. But the French also don't fundamentally change their weapons or doctrine. The rifle remains a British peculiarity, effective but not transformative. Both sides interpret the evidence through existing doctrinal frameworks. The rifle works, but it's an exception, not a revolution. By the end of the Peninsular War in 1814, Britain has won. The 95th has compiled an extraordinary record of service. They fought in nearly every significant engagement over 6 years. Their casualty rate is higher than average, reflecting their dangerous role. But their contributions to victory are substantial and well documented. Soldiers who served with them hold them in high regard. Officers who commanded them appreciate their unique capabilities. But the broader military establishment remains ambivalent about rifles. Yes, they work, but they require special soldiers specially trained. Yes, they're effective, but only in certain terrains and situations. Yes, they're valuable, but not valuable enough to justify general issue. The war ends with Napoleon's first abdication in April 1814. Britain's army will soon undergo massive peacetime reductions, and the rifle's fate in this new era is far from certain. Feel your breath moving slowly in and out. No need to control it, just notice its natural rhythm. Your body knows how to rest. We're entering the period of forgetting now. Section 5. The First Suppression, Peace and Orthodoxy. 1815. Napoleon defeated finally at Waterloo. Europe enters a period of relative peace that will last decades. The great armies assembled for the continental wars must be disbanded. Britain faces enormous war debts and public demand for economy. The army that numbered hundreds of thousands must shrink dramatically. Regiments are reduced, consolidated, or eliminated entirely. The 95th Rifles are not disbanded, but they are reduced. Several battalions are merged, others sent to garrison duties abroad. The intense operational tempo of the Peninsular War becomes memory. Men who perfected their skills over years of campaign are demobilized. The corporate knowledge, the tactical wisdom, slowly dissipates. This is natural when armies contract after war's end. But for specialized units like the 95th, the loss is severe. Rifle skills require constant practice to maintain at high levels. The judgment and tactical thinking take years to develop fully. Garrison duties in peacetime offer little opportunity for either. Young soldiers joining the regiment don't experience the crucible of campaign. They learn the forms but not the substance of rifle warfare. Officers rotate through the regiment as part of career progression. Many have no experience with rifles or their proper tactical employment. They treat the green jackets as regular infantry in different uniforms. The distinctive culture that made the regiment effective begins eroding. Meanwhile, the War Office is reviewing military expenditures critically. Everything must be justified in terms of cost and necessity. The Baker rifle costs more to produce than the Brown Bess musket. Ammunition for it requires more precision, thus more expense. Training riflemen takes longer, meaning more cost per soldier. In peacetime budgets, these factors receive intense scrutiny. Do the benefits of the rifle justify the additional costs? During war, with lives and victory at stake, the answer seemed clearer. In peace, with accountants examining ledgers, it becomes murkier. The rifle's advocates point to the Peninsular War record. The skeptics point to the fact that Britain won with mostly musket-armed infantry. The riflemen were valuable, yes, but not essential to victory. Most battles were decided by traditional line infantry tactics. The rifle contributed certainly, but did it contribute enough? This is the kind of argument that peacetime bureaucracies love. It's impossible to prove counterfactuals about alternate weapon choices. Maybe Britain would have won just as decisively without rifles. Maybe the money spent on riflemen could have bought more musketmen. Maybe specialization is a luxury that peacetime budgets cannot afford. These arguments gain traction in the years after Waterloo, not because they're particularly strong, but because they justify budget cuts. The rifle becomes increasingly marginalized in military planning. The 95th remains, but as a peculiarity, not a model. Some officers continue to advocate for broader rifle adoption. They write articles in military journals, arguing for reform. They cite statistics from the Peninsular War showing rifle effectiveness. They point to developments in other European armies. Prussia, in particular, is expanding its rifle-armed Jaeger units. The United States military is adopting rifles for frontier warfare. Even France, despite losing the war, is experimenting with rifles. But Britain's military establishment has become conservative after victory. Why change a system that won the greatest war in history? Why adopt unproven innovations when current methods work fine? This is the mentality of successful institutions everywhere always. Victory breeds confidence in existing methods and resistance to change. Why risk trying something different when the current approach succeeded? The rifle's advocates cannot overcome this powerful psychological barrier, especially when their arguments cost money in a budget-conscious era. By the 1820s, active resistance to rifles has faded, but it's been replaced by something perhaps more insidious: indifference. The rifle isn't rejected, it's simply not prioritized or promoted. Procurement continues at minimal levels to maintain existing units, but no expansion occurs, no new rifle regiments are formed. Research into improved rifle designs receives no funding or support. Baker's design remains essentially unchanged for decades, not because it can't be improved, but because nobody bothers trying. The institutional energy that drove rifle adoption during the war vanishes. Without an immediate threat, without battlefield urgency, innovation stops. This is the first suppression not through active opposition but through neglect. The lessons of the Peninsular War aren't rejected, they're forgotten, not immediately but gradually as veterans retire and die. Each year, fewer serving officers have personal experience with rifles. Each year, the corporate memory grows a little dimmer. Training manuals from the war era remain on shelves unread. Tactical innovations developed in Spain gather dust in libraries. The practical knowledge of how to employ riflemen effectively erodes. By 1830, most officers have only theoretical knowledge of rifles. They know they exist, they know they're more accurate, but that's about it. The subtle understanding of when and how to use them is lost. Young officers learn tactics from older officers who learned from books. The books were written before the Peninsular War, or by men who misunderstood it, so the chain of transmission breaks, and wisdom becomes mere information. Information without context, without judgment, without practical grounding. The rifle itself physically exists, in armories and in active service, but the knowledge of how to leverage its capabilities has atrophied. This is a pattern we'll see repeated with many military innovations. The hardware persists, but the software, the doctrine, the training, the culture degrades. Some distant colonial conflicts involve riflemen during this period. Small wars in India, Afghanistan, Burma, and Southern Africa. In these engagements, rifles often prove useful once again. The terrain is difficult, the enemy's elusive, the tactics unconventional. Exactly the conditions where rifles excel over muskets. But these conflicts are seen as peripheral to real military thinking. Colonial wars are a separate category, fought by different rules. What works in the Afghan hills is irrelevant to European battlefields, or so the thinking goes among the military establishment. European warfare is civilized, formal, conducted between professional armies. Colonial warfare is irregular, uncivilized, requiring different methods. This artificial distinction allows the army to ignore colonial lessons. The rifle remains useful for frontier warfare but not for serious conflict. This categorization protects orthodox thinking from uncomfortable evidence. By the 1840s, the British Army is thoroughly traditional again. The innovations of the Napoleonic period have been largely abandoned. Doctrine emphasizes the same massed formations and volley fire as before. Training focuses on drill precision and obedience to orders. The brief flowering of tactical flexibility has been pruned back severely. The 95th still exists, still wears green, still carries rifles. But they're an anachronism, a historical curiosity, not the future. Young officers seeking advancement don't request assignment to the rifles. The career path runs through fashionable line regiments, cavalry and guards. The rifle regiments are for eccentrics, provincials, and those without better options. This social relegation is as effective as any formal suppression. The best officers go elsewhere, reducing the rifle unit's effectiveness further. This creates a vicious cycle justifying continued marginalization. If rifle units perform poorly, it's because rifles aren't very effective, not because the units are starved of resources and talented leadership. The logic is circular but self-reinforcing and institutionally convenient. Ezekiel Baker dies in 1838, largely forgotten. His rifle remains in service, but his dream of transformation never materialized. He created a tool that could have revolutionized British military power. Instead, it became a specialty item, useful but never central. The potential he glimpsed in his London workshop went unfulfilled, not because his design was flawed, but because institutions resisted. Not through active opposition, but through passive indifference and neglect. This suppression isn't dramatic or deliberate or even conscious. It's the natural tendency of successful institutions to resist change, to prefer the familiar, to discount the exceptional, to trust the proven. In this case, proven means the musket, traditional tactics, and rigid hierarchy. The rifle threatened all of these, so it was marginalized. Not destroyed, but kept safely contained where it couldn't disrupt. The British Army of the 1840s is comfortable with itself, confident in its methods, secure in its traditions, resistant to innovation. It has forgotten the lessons painfully learned in Spain, or rather, it remembers them as interesting exceptions, not important principles. The rifle is there if needed, but nobody thinks it will be needed. The next major European war, whenever it comes, will be fought properly. With mass armies, traditional tactics, and good old British muskets, surely nothing has changed that would require different thinking. Let yourself sink a little deeper into relaxation now. Your eyelids are heavy, your breathing slow and steady. The story moves on, but you can simply drift with it. Section 6. Sexual Contrasts, European Rifle Traditions. While Britain was suppressing its rifle knowledge, other nations were not. The rifle's history in Europe is much older than Baker's design. German-speaking lands had rifle traditions stretching back centuries. In mountainous regions of Switzerland, Austria, and southern Germany, rifles were standard. Hunters needed accurate weapons for game in difficult terrain. Citizen militias used rifles for defense and shooting competitions. The Jäger, literally hunter, became a military tradition across German states. Jäger units were light infantry, skilled marksmen, wearing green uniforms. They operated independently, using terrain and marksmanship to advantage. Sound familiar? This tradition predates the British 95th by many generations. In fact, Baker studied German rifles when designing his own. The Jäger tradition influenced British thinking about rifle warfare directly. German immigrants to Britain brought rifle-making skills and knowledge. They established workshops and trained British gunsmiths in their techniques. The American frontier developed its own rifle culture independently. Pennsylvania gunsmiths, many of German descent, perfected the long rifle, longer, more accurate, and more reliable than European hunting rifles. American frontiersmen became legendary shots with these weapons. During the American Revolution, American rifle companies terrified British regulars. Shots from ranges British muskets couldn't reach, from concealed positions. Officers targeted specifically, formations harassed, traditional tactics disrupted. This experience should have taught Britain about rifle warfare. And in some ways it did. Ferguson's rifle was a direct response. But after the Revolution, Britain dismissed American tactics as irregular, not real warfare, just frontier skirmishing by undisciplined rabble. The fact that the rabble won the war didn't change this assessment. Victory was attributed to French intervention, British mistakes, anything but American methods, so the lessons about rifles and irregular warfare were discounted. This is a perfect example of how cultural assumptions shape military learning. Britain couldn't accept that amateur colonials taught them anything important. Therefore, whatever they learned from the war must not be important. The rifle in America represents a fascinating cultural phenomenon. In Europe, rifles were associated with hunters, foresters, and mountaineers, specialized professions requiring specialized tools for specialized contexts. In America, the rifle became democratized across the frontier population. Every settler might own a rifle for hunting and defense. Marksmanship was a common skill, not an elite accomplishment. Children learned to shoot almost as soon as they could hold a rifle. This created a population with built-in military capabilities unusual anywhere else. When war came, Americans didn't need extensive training in marksmanship. They needed only tactical organization and military discipline. The rifle was already second nature to them from civilian life. Britain couldn't replicate this because British society was different fundamentally. Firearms ownership was much more restricted, controlled by class and law. Hunting was an aristocratic privilege, not a common necessity. The British soldier came from urban poverty or rural agricultural labor. He had no prior experience with weapons of any kind typically. The military had to train him from zero baseline in limited time. Teaching musket drills was feasible, teaching marksmanship was not. So the American experience couldn't simply be copied to Britain. The social contexts were too different, the assumptions too divergent. But this doesn't explain why Britain dismissed the lessons entirely. Other European nations faced similar social constraints but adopted rifles more broadly. Prussia in particular expanded its Jaeger forces significantly after Waterloo. The Prussian military studied the Napoleonic Wars carefully and drew conclusions. Jaeger units had proven valuable for reconnaissance, screening, and harassment. The Prussian General Staff decided to integrate rifles more thoroughly, not for all infantry, but for substantial specialized light infantry forces. By the 1840s, Prussia had several Jaeger battalions fully equipped. They trained extensively in marksmanship and light infantry tactics. Their doctrine recognized rifles as important, not merely exceptional. France also began experimenting with rifles in the post-Napoleonic period. The experience of fighting British riflemen in Spain left an impression. French military theorists wrote extensively about the rifle's potential. Various rifle designs were tested for possible military adoption. Though France remained primarily a musket-armed force, rifles gained ground slowly. Austria, Russia, and smaller European powers all conducted similar experiments. The rifle was recognized continent-wide as an important development. Only Britain, the nation that had used rifles most effectively during the wars, suppressed them. This paradox reveals something about British military culture specifically. Britain's army was smaller than continental powers, armies generally. It relied on professional volunteers, not mass conscription. Quality over quantity was supposed to be the British advantage. The British soldier was allegedly better trained, more disciplined, more effective. This self-image was central to British military identity. But the rifle threatened this narrative in subtle ways. If individual marksmanship mattered more than collective discipline, what did that imply? Did it suggest continental conscript armies might equal British professionalism? Did it undermine the claim that British soldiers were inherently superior? The musket system allowed Britain to argue its superiority came from training, from drill precision, from iron discipline, from officer leadership. These were British qualities developed through British institutions. The rifle suggested superiority might come from individual skill instead. An individual skill could potentially be developed anywhere, by anyone. This was culturally threatening to British military self-conception. Additionally, British society remained highly caste-conscious throughout this period. The officer corps was drawn from aristocracy and gentry almost exclusively. Common soldiers were from the lowest social orders, often looked down upon. This social division was reinforced by weapons that required no thinking. The musket in the hands of the lower orders, directed by upper-class officers. The rifle gave common soldiers agency, judgment, independence. It suggested they might be capable of thought, decision, intelligence. This threatened the social assumptions underlying military organization. If soldiers could think tactically, why couldn't they think politically? If they deserved trust in battle, why not in society? These questions remained largely unconscious but influenced thinking nonetheless. German Jaeger traditions didn't threaten social order because they emerged organically. They were embedded in existing social structures, guilds, militias, local defense. American rifle culture emerged in a frontier society without rigid hierarchy. Britain was trying to graft rifle warfare onto a deeply hierarchical system. The fit was always uncomfortable, always threatening to undermine something. Religion played an odd role in these cultural contrasts as well. Protestant German states had strong traditions of individual conscience and judgment. The rifle fit naturally into a culture valuing individual capability. Britain's Anglicanism emphasized order, hierarchy, and established authority. The collective volley fire metaphorically aligned with this worldview. These are subtle cultural factors difficult to document directly, but they shape how societies adopt or resist technologies. The rifle wasn't just a tool, it was a bundle of social implications. Different societies interpreted those implications through their existing cultures. For Britain, the implications were more threatening than for others, so Britain's resistance was stronger, its suppression more complete. By the 1850s, this had created an interesting divergence. Continental powers had integrated rifles to varying degrees. America had rifle-armed units and recognized their value. Britain had the most successful historical experience with military rifles. Yet Britain had also most thoroughly marginalized them in peacetime. This divergence would become apparent in the next major European war, and would force Britain to confront its choices once again. Your breathing has slowed naturally to a restful pace. Your body is heavy and comfortable where it rests. We're moving toward the next discovery now, the next cycle. Section 7, the Crimean. Rediscovery, lessons learned again. 1854, Britain enters war against Russia in Crimea. The first major European conflict since Waterloo, 40 years prior. Britain's army is essentially unchanged from the Napoleonic era. Same weapons, same tactics, same organizational structure. The officers are mostly veterans of nothing more than colonial skirmishes. The institutional memory of large-scale European warfare has faded completely. What remains is theory, tradition, and peacetime habits. The Russians, meanwhile, have been learning from their own military history. They've observed developments in rifle technology across Europe. They've developed new tactics for fortification and defensive warfare. The war quickly bogs down into siege operations around Sevastopol. This is exactly the kind of warfare where rifles matter most. Long-range accurate fire between fixed positions targeting visible individuals. But Britain's army is still primarily armed with smoothbore muskets. The Baker rifle remains in limited service with rifle regiments, but most infantry carry weapons essentially identical to Waterloo era. The war exposes this as a serious problem rapidly. Russian artillery outranges British guns in some engagements. Russian defensive positions are well sighted and carefully constructed. British attacks require crossing open ground under sustained fire. The inadequacy of musket fire becomes apparent in this context. Suppressing Russian positions from beyond assault range is nearly impossible. Musket fire at 200 yards is more noise than effective fire. Russian defenders can shoot British attackers with relative impunity. The rifle regiments demonstrate their value once again in this environment. At Inkerman, rifle companies occupy forward positions effectively. They provide early warning and harassing fire against Russian movements. During the siege of Sevastopol, they counter-snipe against Russian marksmen. The old patterns from Spain repeat themselves in a new theater. Where riflemen are employed properly, they prove invaluable. But there aren't enough of them to make a strategic difference. and most commanders still don't know how to use them effectively. Meanwhile, technological development has continued despite British neglect. French Army Captain Claude-Étienne Minier developed a new bullet design. The Minier ball is conical with a hollow base, not a sphere. When fired, expanding gases flare the hollow base into the rifling. This means the bullet can be loaded as easily as a smoothbore ball, but it engages the rifling for accuracy when fired. This solves the rifle's major practical problem, slow loading under fouling. A rifled musket with Minier balls combines accuracy with speed. France has adopted this technology for its military before the war. British observers in Crimea noticed the French rifle effectiveness immediately. The Minier rifled musket is accurate to 300 yards reliably. It loads nearly as quickly as a smoothbore in practiced hands. It uses standard military musket actions, not specialized mechanisms. And it's cheaper to produce than precision rifles like the Baker. This is the technological breakthrough that should transform everything. It makes the rifle practical for general infantry issue finally. All the old arguments about cost and loading speed become obsolete. The Minier rifled musket offers the best of both systems combined. British military observers write enthusiastic reports about this development. They recommend immediate adoption for British forces as soon as possible. The War Office begins procurement of rifled muskets in 1853. The Patton 1853 Enfield rifled musket enters service. Using the Minier system, accurate to 600 yards in good conditions. This should represent a revolution in British military capability. Finally, the rifle's advantages become available to all infantry. Finally, the lessons of the Peninsular War can be universally applied. Finally, British military power can be modernized appropriately. But institutional change is more complicated than just changing weapons. The Enfield rifled musket is issued to troops in Crimea, but the training, tactics, and doctrine remain unchanged from before. Soldiers receive weapons capable of aimed fire at long range, but they're still trained to fire volleys on command without aiming. The potential of the new weapon goes largely unrealized as a result. Commanders use rifled musket-armed infantry exactly like old musket infantry. They form the same lines, fire the same volleys, use the same tactics. The longer effective range should allow engagement at greater distances, but doctrine says close to bayonet range, so they close regardless. The improved accuracy should enable selective targeting of leaders and key personnel, but doctrine says fire in volley at the formation, so they do. The rifle has been adopted, but rifle warfare has not. This is a crucial distinction often missed in military history. Technology changes faster than doctrine, culture, or training. Simply issuing new equipment doesn't automatically confer new capabilities. Those capabilities must be developed through practice, study, and adaptation. But the Crimean War doesn't last long enough for this adaptation to occur. Peace comes in 1856, just 2 years after war began. The war is generally seen as a mismanaged disaster by Britain. Logistics, medical care, command coordination all failed catastrophically. The famous Charge of the Light Brigade becomes a symbol of incompetence. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms overshadow tactical lessons learned. In the aftermath, there's a desire to forget the whole embarrassing episode, not to study it carefully and learn its lessons systematically. So once again, rifle-related innovations get lost in the shuffle. The Enfield rifled musket remains the standard infantry weapon going forward. This is progress certainly, compared to smoothbore muskets persisting. But the deeper lessons about rifle employment remain unlearned. The Baker rifle and its associated tactics fade even further into history. The specialized rifle regiments lose their distinctive character gradually. If all infantry now have rifles, what makes rifle regiments special? They retain their green jackets and traditional independence, but the doctrinal distinctions blur as general weapons capabilities converge. Ironically, universal rifle adoption undermines specialized rifle units. By the 1860s, the British Army is better armed than ever before. Every infantryman carries a weapon accurate to several hundred yards, but the tactics and training haven't caught up to the technology. Armies drill for mass volley fire at close range still. Officers are taught traditional formations and conventional maneuvers. The potential of rifles to enable new forms of warfare goes unexplored. Prussia, meanwhile, is learning different lessons from similar experiences. The Prussian General Staff studies Crimea carefully and draws conclusions. They note the importance of long-range accurate fire in modern war. They note how defensive positions become stronger with improved weapons. They note that traditional mass charges suffer catastrophic casualties. These observations inform Prussian military reforms in the following decade. Training emphasizes marksmanship, not just drill precision. Tactics incorporate more dispersed formations, less rigid lines. Officers are taught to adapt to circumstances, not follow rote plans. This will pay enormous dividends in the wars of the 1860s. But Britain, having experienced the same war, learns less systematically. The institutional capacity for learning from experience seems diminished. Or perhaps Britain, secure in its empire, feels less urgency to adapt. Continental powers face each other directly, driving competitive improvement. Britain's main military focus is colonial policing and naval supremacy. Land warfare against peer opponents seems a rare exception, so the lessons from Crimea don't drive the reforms they should. The rifle has been adopted, and that's considered sufficient. The harder work of transforming doctrine and training doesn't happen. This is the second rediscovery of the rifle's importance. But like the first during the Napoleonic Wars, it's incomplete. The technology is recognized and adopted this time, unlike before. But the tactical and doctrinal implications remain partly invisible. The full potential of rifle-armed infantry stays unrealized. And soon, even the limited progress made will face reversal. Notice how relaxed your jaw has become, how your shoulders have dropped away from your ears. Your body is doing exactly what it needs to do. We're moving through another cycle now, another pattern emerging. SE section, EIJ, the human dimension, Amid fire psychology. The rifle changes more than just tactical possibilities on battlefields. It changes the psychological experience of combat for soldiers. This is a dimension often overlooked in discussions of military technology. But it matters profoundly for how warfare is experienced and understood. Consider the musketeer in a traditional Napoleonic line formation. He stands shoulder to shoulder with his comrades in tight ranks. Officers and sergeants pace behind, maintaining alignment and discipline. The enemy appears as a mass, a formation, a collective entity. When the order comes to fire, he presents his musket and shoots. He doesn't aim at an individual, he fires into the enemy mass. Whether his ball hits anyone is impossible to know. Dozens or hundreds of muskets fire simultaneously in a crashing volley. Smoke obscures everything immediately after the discharge. By the time visibility returns, everything has changed. Who killed whom is unknowable and unimportant in this context. The individual soldier is absolved of personal responsibility for killing. He was following orders, firing as part of a collective action. The killing is impersonal, mechanical, almost ritualized. This psychological structure makes the act of killing more bearable. It distributes responsibility across the formation, across the system. No single soldier can say, "I killed that man," with certainty. Everyone participated. No one is individually culpable. Military organizations have evolved this structure over centuries of warfare. It protects soldiers' psychological health while accomplishing military objectives. The rifle disrupts this protective psychological structure dramatically. A rifleman aims at an individual, not a formation. He sees his target clearly, evaluates the shot, makes adjustments. He watches the target fall, knows with certainty that his bullet struck. There's no volley to hide behind, no collective diffusion of responsibility. He killed that specific person deliberately through personal skill. This psychological burden is substantially heavier than musket warfare. The rifleman carries individual responsibility for individual deaths. He must reconcile this with his moral and emotional framework. Some men find this tolerable or even satisfying in ways they can't articulate. Others find it deeply troubling, though they may not admit this. The military doesn't provide much framework for processing these feelings. Soldiers are expected to kill enemies without psychological complications, but the human psyche is more complex than official expectations acknowledge. Riflemen from the 95th left memoirs revealing these tensions. Some wrote with pride about their marksmanship and confirmed kills. Rifleman Harris's memoir describes shooting with clinical detachment. The enemy becomes targets, problems to solve, not human beings. This psychological distancing is necessary for functional performance. But reading between the lines, one senses the toll it took. Other riflemen wrote with more explicit moral conflict and discomfort. They described nightmares about men they'd killed in battle. They wondered about the families of French soldiers they'd shot. They questioned whether God could forgive deliberate killing, even in war. These moral struggles rarely appear in official military records, but they shaped how riflemen experienced their service deeply. Officers noticed that riflemen sometimes seemed different from line infantry. More thoughtful, more independent, but also more introspective. Sometimes harder to manage in garrison, though superb in combat. The rifle selected for certain personality types and created others. Men who could handle the psychological burden of individual killing, or men who learned to suppress their feelings about it effectively. This connects to broader questions about what societies want from soldiers. Do we want thinking individuals who make moral judgments about their actions? Or do we want obedient instruments who follow orders without reflection? The musket warfare model supports the latter vision clearly. The rifle warfare model tends toward the former, whether intended or not. This created a fundamental tension in military culture and organization. The ideal soldier in traditional thinking is obedient but not thoughtful, brave but not questioning, dedicated but not independent. The rifle demands thoughtfulness, judgment, and independence. This makes excellent riflemen potentially problematic soldiers in other respects. What if their habit of independent judgment extends beyond shooting decisions? What if they start evaluating orders, strategies, even war aims? This is the officer corps' nightmare, thinking soldiers questioning authority. Better to have obedient masses than capable individuals who might question. This anxiety isn't paranoid or irrational from the officer's perspective. Military effectiveness depends on hierarchical authority and discipline. Anything that weakens this structure threatens military cohesion. The rifle, by requiring individual judgment, does threaten hierarchy subtly, not intentionally, but through the habits of mind it develops. Some historical evidence suggests riflemen were indeed more independent-minded. Rifle regiments had more disciplinary issues in garrison conditions. Men who could think for themselves in combat also questioned garrison routines. They saw pointless regulations as pointless, not as character-building exercises. This made them less ideal from a peacetime administration perspective, which reinforced the view that rifles were fine for wartime but problematic otherwise. The psychological dimension also affects how riflemen were viewed by enemies. French soldiers who faced British riflemen in Spain expressed specific hatreds, not the general hatred of enemies, but something more personal and bitter. The riflemen didn't fight fairly, according to conventional warfare norms. They hid, they shot from long range, they targeted individuals deliberately. This violated unspoken rules about how honorable warfare should be conducted. Officers and drummers were traditionally somewhat protected on battlefields, not completely, but there was a mutual understanding about limiting some targeting. Riflemen violated these norms by specifically targeting leadership and communications. This was tactically effective but seen as somehow unsporting or dishonorable. The French weren't wrong to see something different in rifle warfare. It did represent a shift toward more personal, deliberate, targeted killing, away from the ritualized mass exchanges of traditional linear warfare, towards something that felt more like murder, less like battle. These moral distinctions may seem arbitrary or hypocritical to us now. All warfare involves killing. What difference does the method make? But to participants, these distinctions mattered psychologically and morally. The way killing happens shapes how it's experienced and remembered. Riflemen occupied a morally ambiguous space in military culture, necessary and valued, but also slightly disturbing and transgressive. Heroes when winning battles, but not quite gentlemen in how they won. This ambiguity extended to how riflemen saw themselves too. Some took pride in their elite status and superior skills. Others felt ambivalent about being professional killers of individuals. This psychological complexity makes the rifle's story more human somehow. It's not just about technology or tactics or institutional resistance. It's about human beings struggling with what warfare requires of them. The musket let soldiers hide behind collective action and obedience. The rifle stripped away that protection, demanding more of individuals. Not everyone wanted that burden, and not everyone handled it well. This may partly explain institutional resistance beyond practical objections. The rifle demanded more from soldiers, psychologically, morally, intellectually. Building an army of such soldiers was more difficult than an army of obedient musketeers. It required different selection, different training, different leadership. It meant accepting soldiers as thinking individuals, not interchangeable parts. Many officers and institutions weren't ready for that transformation. They preferred the simpler, if less effective, model of mass musket warfare. The rifle kept returning because its tactical advantages were undeniable, but it kept being suppressed because its human implications were uncomfortable. This tension has never been fully resolved in military organizations. Even today, with universal rifle issue, the tension between individual agency and military hierarchy persists. Special forces embrace individual skill and judgment wholeheartedly. Conventional forces still emphasize collective action and obedience primarily. The rifle created this split, or at least made it visible and undeniable. Baker couldn't have anticipated these implications when designing his weapon. He was solving a technical problem about accuracy and loading speed. But he inadvertently created a tool that challenged military culture fundamentally. That's often how technological change works in human societies. The immediate effects are obvious and intended. The deeper effects emerge slowly and weren't anticipated at all. The rifle changed warfare tactically, which everyone could see. But it also changed warfare psychologically, which fewer people recognized. And it's the psychological changes that may matter more in the long run, because they affect how societies think about military service and war itself. Let your attention drift if it wants to. There's no need to track every word precisely. Your mind can wander while the story continues. Rest is the goal, not comprehension. SE Section 9, Material Evolution, From Baker to Modern Rifles. The story of the rifle doesn't end with the Baker design, obviously. Once rifling proved its value in military contexts, development accelerated. The 19th century saw continuous improvement in rifle technology, each advance built on previous innovations, solving prior limitations. The Mini-A ball system addressed the loading speed problem by 1850, but other challenges remained to be solved through further innovation. Breech loading mechanisms replaced muzzle loading in the 1860s. This dramatically increased rate of fire and simplified the loading process. A soldier could load while prone, protected behind cover. He didn't need to stand exposed to ram a ball down the barrel. This single change transformed infantry tactics and battlefield survivability. The Prussian Drazy needle gun demonstrated breech loading advantages as early as 1841, but Britain didn't adopt breech loading universally until the 1870s. The Martini Henry rifle became the standard British infantry weapon in 1871. It combined breech loading with a powerful cartridge and robust action, accurate to 500 yards, with aimed fire of 12 rounds per minute. This was a quantum leap over the Baker rifle's capabilities. Yet the tactical principles Baker's rifle demonstrated remained relevant always. Accuracy mattered, individual aimed fire mattered, independent soldier judgment mattered. The technology evolved, but the underlying tactical revolution stayed constant. Metallic cartridges replaced paper cartridges through the 1860s. These were more reliable, weatherproof, and faster to load. They also enabled the development of repeating mechanisms eventually. The American Civil War demonstrated the impact of rifled muskets decisively. Both sides used rifles as their primary infantry weapons. The result was slaughter on a scale unprecedented in Western warfare. Defensive positions became nearly impregnable against frontal assault. Attackers suffered horrific casualties crossing open ground under rifle fire. Entire battles turned into attritional nightmares of entrenched positions. This should have taught European powers about modern rifle warfare's implications. It didn't, or not as completely as it should have. American military experience was again dismissed as a special case. The war was seen as a civil conflict between amateur armies, not professional warfare. Its lessons were considered less applicable to European military contexts. This dismissal would prove catastrophically wrong in the First World War. But that was still decades in the future from the 1860s. Magazine-fed repeating rifles emerged in the 1880s and 90s. These allowed a soldier to fire multiple shots without reloading between each one. The Lee Metford and later Lee Enfield became Britain's standard infantry rifles. 10-round magazines, bolt-action mechanisms, extreme reliability. The Lee Enfield in particular became one of history's great military rifles. It served British forces through 2 world wars and beyond. Its design refined the lessons learned from Baker's original innovation: accuracy, reliability, ease of use, soldier-centered design. The technical evolution continued into smokeless powder and higher velocities, into smaller calibers with better ballistics and lighter ammunition, into optical sights for even greater accuracy and range. Each innovation built on the foundation that earlier rifles established. But notice what hasn't changed from Baker's time through the modern era. The fundamental principle that accurate individual fire matters tactically, that trained soldiers making judgment calls outperform mechanical obedience, that infantry effectiveness comes from individual skill as much as collective discipline. These principles were discovered in the Napoleonic Wars with Baker rifles. They were suppressed, rediscovered, suppressed again, finally accepted. But the acceptance took over a century to become complete and universal. Even with Lee Enfields in every soldier's hands, doctrine lagged behind technology. First World War tactics initially assumed rifles were just faster muskets, massed infantry attacks across open ground, expecting to close with bayonets. German machine guns demonstrated the fatal flaw in this thinking immediately. The rifle, especially supported by machine guns, made traditional attacks impossible. Warfare devolved into trenches, attrition, and industrial-scale killing. This was the logical endpoint of rifle technology's defensive advantages. What had been learned in the American Civil War, forgotten by Europe, now relearned at the cost of millions of lives in France. The pattern of discovery, suppression, rediscovery at the grandest scale. By 1918, everyone understood rifles had changed warfare permanently. No more massed formations, no more glorious cavalry charges. War had become industrial, technological, and utterly impersonal despite individual weapons. The Second World War continued these trends with semi-automatic and automatic rifles, increasing rates of fire, magazine capacities, and tactical flexibility. American M1 Garand, Soviet SBT-40, German Gewehr 43. These represented the maturation of rifle technology into modern form. Accurate, rapid-firing, reliable, versatile weapons for infantry combat. The individual rifleman remained the fundamental unit of military power. Everything else, tanks, aircraft, artillery, supported the infantry's tactical role. This was the final, complete acceptance of what Baker had begun. the rifle as the central weapon of military forces universally, but even this acceptance carried forward the old tensions between individual skill and collective discipline, between soldier judgment and officer control, between technological capability and doctrinal employment. Modern armies still struggle with these tensions in interesting ways. Special operations forces embrace individual skill, judgment, and flexibility. Conventional forces still emphasize standardization and collective action. The rifle didn't resolve these tensions, it made them permanent features of military life. Baker's technical innovation created tactical possibilities. Those possibilities created doctrinal questions. Those questions revealed cultural and social tensions. The rifle's evolution mirrors broader military modernization, from artisan craftsmanship to industrial mass production, from aristocratic officer corps to professional military education, from national armies to global military-industrial complexes. Each change built on previous changes, accelerating over time, but the fundamental dynamic remained constant throughout, technology enabling new capabilities faster than doctrine could adapt, institutions resisting changes that threatened comfortable assumptions, crises forcing adaptation that wouldn't happen voluntarily. Then memory fading, old lessons forgotten, the cycle repeating. The rifle is just one example of this larger pattern, but it's a particularly clear example, traceable over 2 centuries. From Baker's workshop to modern assault rifles, the thread runs continuous. Not smooth evolution, but punctuated equilibrium. Long periods of stasis interrupted by rapid adaptive bursts, then return to stasis until the next crisis forces change. This pattern characterizes not just military technology but innovation generally. Institutions prefer stability over optimal performance usually. Change happens only when stability becomes untenable for some reason. The rifle forced change repeatedly because its advantages were so clear. But each time institutions tried to contain the change, limit its implications. Only gradually, over generations, did the full transformation occur. And even now, the transformation remains incomplete in some respects. The rifle changed warfare, but warfare's deeper nature resists change stubbornly. Your breathing continues at its own peaceful rhythm, deep and even, without any effort required. We're approaching the final sections now, but there's no urgency, just gentle continuation. SE Section 10, Final Recognition, the 20th Century Perspective. By the mid-20th century, military historians could look back clearly. They had sufficient distance to see patterns invisible to participants. The rifle story became a case study in military innovation, and in institutional resistance to innovation despite clear evidence. John Keegan wrote about the face of battle through different eras. He compared Waterloo's musket warfare with Somm's rifle warfare. The technological difference was immense, but doctrinal adaptation lagged. Commanders in 1916 used tactics that Napoleonic generals would recognize, despite weapons that would have seemed like magic in 1815. This lag between technological capability and tactical employment fascinated historians. Why do institutions resist learning from experience so consistently? Why do lessons need to be relearned at such terrible cost? The rifle's story provided clear examples to analyze these questions. Other military historians examined the social dimensions more closely. They noted how the rifle threatened class hierarchies in military organization, how it empowered common soldiers at the expense of officer prerogatives, how it suggested merit might matter more than social standing. These weren't just military issues, but reflections of broader social tensions. The rifle became a lens for examining authority, class, and social change. Its suppression wasn't technical but political and cultural at root. This realization changed how military history was written and understood, not just as technological progress and battlefield tactics, but as social history, cultural history, the history of institutions. The rifle touched on questions about democracy and citizenship too. If common soldiers needed judgment and skill, did that imply political capacity? If they could be trusted with deadly force independently, why not with votes? These questions remained largely unspoken but shaped attitudes nevertheless. Rifle-armed citizen soldiers fit Republican ideals better than musket-armed masses. America's rifle culture connected to its democratic self-conception. Britain's musket preference reflected its more hierarchical social structure, at least until democratic reforms forced military modernization too. By the late 20th century, special operations forces revived earlier patterns, small units of highly trained individuals operating independently, using superior skills to multiply effectiveness beyond numbers. This was essentially the 95th Rifles model, now universal in special operations. Green Berets, SAS, SEALs, all emphasized individual excellence and judgment. All traced lineage back to rifle regiments and similar formations. The British SAS specifically drew on Second World War special operations, but those units consciously modeled themselves on rifle regiment traditions. The Green Beret worn by Special Forces has symbolic connections to Rifle Green. This wasn't accidental but deliberate acknowledgement of historical continuity. The lessons Baker's rifle demonstrated had finally been fully absorbed, but it took a century and a half to complete that absorption. Modern military education uses the rifle's story as a teaching tool. Staff colleges around the world discuss Baker rifle history, not for technical details but for lessons about institutional learning, about how good ideas get suppressed by organizational inertia, about how evidence gets misinterpreted through doctrinal assumptions, about how social factors shape seemingly technical military decisions. The rifle becomes a metaphor for innovation challenges generally. Its story is told to officers as a cautionary tale. Don't be the general who ignores the rifle means don't ignore innovation. Whether this teaching actually changes institutional behavior is unclear. Modern militaries still struggle with innovation and adaptation constantly. They still resist changes that threaten comfortable assumptions. They still interpret evidence through existing doctrinal frameworks. The rifle story is taught, but its lessons may not be fully learned. Some historians argue the rifle's real impact was psychological, not tactical. That it changed how societies thought about warfare fundamentally, from collective ritualized violence to individual deliberate killing, from massed formations to dispersed individual actors, from warfare as social spectacle to warfare as industrial process. The rifle didn't cause these changes alone, obviously, but it was part of the complex of technologies driving military modernization. Telegraph, railroad, machine gun, artillery, aircraft all contributed, but the rifle was there at the beginning, leading the transformation. Baker couldn't have imagined aircraft or tanks or nuclear weapons, but his rifle started the cascade of changes that made modern warfare, not through any grand vision or revolutionary intent, just through solving a practical problem with elegant engineering. This raises questions about technological determinism in history. Do technologies drive social change, or do societies shape technology use? The rifle story suggests both processes operate simultaneously. The technology enabled certain capabilities that weren't possible before, but society chose when and how to adopt those capabilities, and societies made different choices based on cultural contexts. So technology creates possibilities, but culture determines actualization. Neither determines the other. They interact in complex feedback loops. The rifle changed warfare, which changed society, which changed how rifles were used. This dialectical process continues today with contemporary military technology. Drones, autonomous weapons, cyber warfare capabilities. Each creates possibilities that societies must decide how to use. Each threatens existing assumptions about warfare and military organization. Each will likely face resistance similar to what the rifle faced, because the underlying dynamics of institutional change remain constant. Organizations prefer stability, resist uncertainty, protect established interests. Innovation happens only when crisis makes resistance untenable. Then innovation is grudgingly adopted, its implications contained as much as possible. Later historians will look back at our era and see similar patterns. Technologies that should have transformed military thinking but were suppressed initially. Lessons learned, forgotten, relearned at terrible cost. Evidence misinterpreted through outdated doctrinal frameworks. The pattern repeats because human institutions are conservative by nature. Baker's rifle is history, but its story remains perpetually relevant, not as artifact, but as case study in how change happens slowly, how knowledge gets lost despite being documented and proven, how institutions resist learning even from their own successes, how social and cultural factors outweigh technical evidence. These lessons matter beyond military history specifically. They apply to any field where innovation challenges established practice, where new capabilities threaten existing authority structures, where evidence contradicts comfortable assumptions and established interests. The rifle's 2-century journey from innovation to acceptance teaches patience. Change takes longer than it should, costs more than it should. But change happens eventually if the innovation is genuinely superior. The rifle prevailed because its advantages were ultimately undeniable. Not quickly, not smoothly, but eventually and completely. This should give hope to innovators facing resistance today. Your good ideas may be suppressed, forgotten, dismissed repeatedly. But if they're genuinely better, they'll eventually prevail. Just maybe not in your lifetime, and not as you imagined. Baker died thinking his rifle had been marginalized and forgotten. He couldn't see that he'd planted seeds that would eventually flourish, that his innovation would become the foundation of all modern infantry, that military historians would study his work centuries later. Sometimes that's how innovation works, slow, frustrating, incomplete during one's lifetime, but historically significant nonetheless, shaping futures we won't see. Rest deeply now as we approach the conclusion. Your body has found its natural state of comfort. Your mind can drift freely without holding on to anything. Just a bit more story, then we'll bring things to a close. Section 11. Closing reflections and contemporary parallels. We've traced the rifle's journey across more than 2 centuries now, from Ezekiel Baker's London workshop to modern military forces worldwide, through periods of discovery, suppression, rediscovery, and eventual acceptance, through wars that proved its value and peace that forgot those lessons. What can we learn from this long, circular, frustrating journey? First, that good ideas face resistance even when evidence supports them. The rifle's superiority was demonstrated repeatedly in battlefield conditions. Its tactical advantages were documented, studied, and confirmed, yet it was suppressed twice, marginalized repeatedly, adopted grudgingly. This wasn't because of lack of evidence, but because of institutional inertia. Organizations resist change that threatens their comfortable assumptions. They reinterpret evidence to fit existing frameworks rather than change frameworks. This pattern appears across all human institutions, not just militaries. Science, medicine, education, business, all resist innovations that challenge orthodoxy. The rifle's story is unusual only in how clearly documented it is. Second, that technological capability and doctrinal employment are different things. Having a rifle doesn't automatically mean knowing how to use it. The British Army had Baker rifles but often used them like muskets. They had Enfield-rifled muskets but retained volley fire tactics. Technology creates possibilities. Doctrine determines whether they're realized. Many organizations adopt new technologies while retaining old practices. They computerize inefficient processes rather than redesigning the processes. They add new capabilities without changing how they think about problems. The result is expensive tools used poorly, potential unrealized. True innovation requires changing practices, not just acquiring technology. Third, that social and cultural factors shape technical military decisions. The rifle threatened British military hierarchy and social order subtly. It empowered common soldiers and suggested they might be capable of judgment. This was as much a reason for its suppression as any technical argument. We like to think technical decisions are made on technical merits, but they're always embedded in social contexts and political considerations. The best solution technically may be unacceptable socially or politically. Understanding this helps explain otherwise puzzling organizational choices. Fourth, that institutional memory is fragile and must be actively maintained. The British Army learned rifle warfare lessons in Spain. Then it forgot them during peace, despite them being documented. Then it relearned them in Crimea, then forgot them again. Knowledge doesn't automatically persist in institutions across generations. It must be actively transmitted, renewed, kept relevant and living. When knowledge becomes merely historical, it loses its power to guide action. Organizations must continuously reconnect with their own experiences. Fifth, that the cycle of discovery, suppression, rediscovery is common in military history. Many innovations follow similar patterns across decades or centuries. Tank warfare, aircraft carriers, special operations, all faced similar cycles. Proven in one context, suppressed afterward, rediscovered in crisis. This suggests the pattern comes from institutional nature, not specific circumstances. Peacetime militaries become conservative. Wartime forces innovate desperately. Then peace returns. Innovation is suppressed. The cycle repeats. Breaking this cycle requires conscious institutional effort against natural tendencies. Sixth, that innovation's full implications often aren't apparent immediately. Baker thought he was solving a technical problem about accuracy. He didn't realize he was challenging military hierarchy and social order. The rifle's tactical implications became clear quickly enough. But its social, psychological, and political implications took generations. Innovators can't foresee all consequences of their innovations. Some implications only become visible much later, in different contexts. This should make us humble about predicting technology's social impact. Seventh, that distance and time provide perspective impossible for participants. People living through the rifle's development couldn't see the patterns. Each decision made sense in its immediate context and circumstances. Only historians looking backward could identify the cycles and dynamics. We're currently living through similar technological and social changes. Artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, biotechnology, and more. We probably can't see the patterns we're creating in real time. Future historians will identify cycles we're blind to currently. This should make us cautious about our ability to manage technological change. We're less in control than we imagine, more subject to forces we don't understand. The best we can do is try to learn from historical patterns, and hope we're slightly wiser than our predecessors in managing innovation. The rifle's story also connects to contemporary debates about warfare's future. Should military forces emphasize expensive high-tech systems or numerous cheap capabilities? Should they focus on professional expertise or distributed capability? Should they centralize control or empower independent action? These are the same questions the rifle raised 2 centuries ago. They still don't have definitive answers because they depend on context. Different threats, terrains, and objectives require different approaches. The rifle taught that lesson too. No single solution fits all circumstances. For those of us not in military service, the rifle's story still resonates. It's about how organizations handle change, how knowledge gets lost and found. It's about the tension between individual capability and collective action. It's about how social structures shape what appears to be technical choices. These dynamics appear in every workplace, every institution we encounter. Understanding them helps us navigate our own organizational challenges. When your good idea faces resistance, remember the rifle story. When evidence is ignored, when lessons are forgotten, when change is blocked, you're experiencing dynamics that are centuries old and deeply rooted. This doesn't mean giving up or accepting resistance passively, but it means understanding what you're up against and why. Institutional change is hard because institutions are designed to resist change. That's their function, to provide stability, continuity, and predictability. Innovation is important, but so is organizational stability. The question is finding the right balance between continuity and adaptation. The rifle story suggests this balance is never permanent or perfect. It must be continuously renegotiated as circumstances change. Sometimes institutions need to change, sometimes institutions need to change, sometimes they need to resist. Wisdom lies in knowing which response fits which circumstances. The rifle ultimately prevailed because its advantages were overwhelming. In enough different contexts, with enough supporting evidence, resistance collapsed. But it took a century and a half and 2 world wars. That's a long time to wait for good ideas to triumph. For individuals, the timescale is discouraging and frustrating. Baker died without seeing his innovation fully vindicated and accepted. Most innovators face similar disappointments, their contributions only recognized later. This is part of the burden of being ahead of your time. But the rifle story also shows that good ideas do eventually win. The truth has a stubborn persistence that outlasts institutional resistance. What works eventually gets adopted, however long it takes. This should provide some comfort to those fighting for good changes. You may not see victory, but you're contributing to its eventual arrival. As we close this story, think about what patterns you see. In your own life, your own work, your own organizations, where are good ideas being suppressed by comfortable assumptions? Where is evidence being ignored because it challenges orthodoxy? Where are lessons being forgotten because they're no longer convenient? Where are innovations being adopted in form but not in spirit? These patterns are everywhere once you learn to see them. The rifle's story trains our eyes to recognize institutional dynamics, not to become cynical, but to become realistic and strategic, to understand how change actually happens, not how we wish it happened, to be patient with the process while still pushing for improvement. The rifle is a piece of military history from 2 centuries past, but its story remains alive because its patterns continue today. In different forms, different contexts, different technologies, but the same basic dynamics of innovation, resistance, and change. Understanding this helps us be better participants in our own historical moment, not passive observers but active agents, aware of the forces we're navigating. The rifle changed warfare forever, but it took forever to do so. That's both discouraging and encouraging in equal measure. Change is possible but hard, slow, but ultimately irresistible. This is the lesson Baker's rifle teaches across 2 centuries. Subscription, call to action. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with this story. The journey through the rifle's history has been long and winding, just like the history itself, full of cycles and repetitions. This is what boring history bedtime is all about always. Taking historical topics and examining them slowly, thoroughly, contemplatively, finding the patterns that repeat across time and contexts, understanding how human institutions work or fail to work, and doing all of this in a way that helps you drift towards sleep. If you've enjoyed this format, please consider subscribing. Subscriptions help create more content like this in the future. They support the research, writing, and production of these deep dives. And they tell me that this style of historical exploration has value. Every subscription directly enables the creation of the next episode. There's no ads, no sponsors, just the direct support of listeners. This keeps the content focused on quality over clickbait, on depth over brevity, on contemplation over excitement. If this approach to history resonates with you, please subscribe. If you found yourself learning while also relaxing, please subscribe. If you appreciate the combination of rigor and restfulness, please subscribe. Your support makes this work possible and sustainable long term. And if subscribing isn't possible right now, that's completely fine. Sharing the podcast with others who might enjoy it also helps. Leaving a rating or review on your podcast platform helps too. Word of mouth is how most people discover this content. Every share, every mention, every recommendation makes a difference. Together, we're creating a space for slow history, for deep thinking, for allowing our minds to engage with complex topics while also unwinding. This is an unusual combination, but clearly some people value it. If you're one of them, welcome and thank you for being here. Now, as we truly close, bring your attention back to your body. Feel the weight of your head against the pillow one more time. Notice how your breathing has changed since we began. Slower now, deeper, more relaxed and natural. Your body has been releasing tension throughout this journey. Now let yourself sink completely into rest. The story is finished, the patterns examined, the lessons considered. All that remains is sleep, gentle and welcoming. Let the rifle's long journey fade from your mind. Let thoughts drift away like smoke from black powder. Feel yourself settling into the darkness, safe and comfortable. The past is distant now, separated by centuries and continents. You're here, now, in this moment, in this place. Everything is exactly as it needs to be. Your body knows what to do next. Trust it, release control, simply allow. Sleep is close now, perhaps already here. Let yourself go, let yourself rest. The rifle's story is told. Your story continues tomorrow. For now, sleep. Just sleep.